Hello, everyone. This is Jessica Rackley from the National Governors Association. Welcome to our webinar on state strategies to advance energy storage. I'm going to give attendees a couple more minutes to join in, and then we will start the webinar. Thanks. Hello, everyone, and welcome to NGA's webinar on energy storage. My name is Jessica Rackley. I'm a senior policy analyst here within our Environment, Energy, and Transportation Division at NGA's Center for Best Practices. So we have a wonderful lineup for today's webinar. As I mentioned earlier, I'm Jessica Rackley, and I'm going to give an overview of NGA's recent paper on energy storage called Powering Up State Trends for Advancing the Use of Energy Storage. And I gave everyone here a link for how to access that paper. Then we have Angie Dykema, the director of the Nevada Governor's Office of Energy, and she's going to talk about some of Nevada's recent activities, including the PUC's consideration of including energy storage in resource planning and consideration of an energy storage procurement target. Then we have Ann Margolis, who is the Renewable Energy Development Director at the Vermont Department of Public Service, and she's going to give an overview of Vermont's recent report on the impacts of deploying energy storage in the state. So just some general guidelines for today's webinar. The webinar will be recorded, and we'll send out a link to this recording sometime early next week, and you feel free to share it with others within your state agencies. First off, I will provide a brief overview of our NGA's recent energy storage paper called Powering Up, and then each state expert, Angie and then Ann, will speak for about 20 minutes. After the presentations, there will be a Q&A period for the remaining 10 to 15 minutes or so of this webinar. And please send all questions in writing to me in the questions box on the GoToWebinar control panel, or you can send them to me via email to jrackley@nga.org. And this slide just shows you how to submit questions. So you can see in the GoToWebinar pane towards the bottom, there's a questions box where you can type in questions to me. So first off, I want to provide an overview of NGA's recent paper on energy storage called Powering Up State Trends for Advancing the Use of Energy Storage. This paper just came out a couple of weeks ago, and it's an update to a paper that we developed that was released in October 2016. So this recent energy storage paper just looks at recent state activities from October 2016 to July of this year. And this recent paper focuses on three main areas of recent state activities, so procurement targets, financial incentives, and then educational and R&D efforts. And then the 2016 paper that we wrote on energy storage, which many of you may have seen, also discussed, in addition to these three main categories of policies, 4 other policy categories, including incorporating energy storage in state energy planning, recognizing the multiple benefits of storage and state regulations, developing, streamlining, siting, approval, and interconnection processes, and encouraging the assessment of storage and energy reliability and resiliency efforts. So just to go over to some recent trends we're seeing regarding energy storage deployment and state policy activities. So from October 2016, when we first came out with our first energy storage paper, to July of this year, which is the coverage of our recent energy storage paper that was released a couple of weeks ago, we're seeing 18 states within this past year that have implemented or initiated an energy storage policy, for a total of around 33 states in the U.S. taking action. So most states have some sort of energy storage policy action in place. We're also seeing a tremendous increase in energy storage deployment. So capacity grew threefold in 5 years alone, from 442 megawatts in May 2012 to 1.5 gigawatts in May 2017. So we're seeing a tremendous increase in deployment. Lithium-ion batteries still account for more than 95% of advanced energy storage deployment in the first half of 2017. We also are predicting that, and this is just based on different reports we've seen, but energy storage will be cost competitive with natural gas peaking plants in the next 5 years or so. Prices are going down quite a bit. California accounts for 41% of the energy storage projects in the U.S. and 21% of installed capacity. But we also see a lot of energy storage deployment in Arizona, Nevada, and Texas. And we're going to be hearing a little bit more about Nevada's efforts in a little bit. So looking at particular recent state activity, the first one I want to talk about is energy storage procurement targets. So we've seen a lot of activity in this realm within the past year or so. The first one that I want to cover is the New York PSC earlier this year ordered each IOU in the state to have at least 2 energy storage pilot projects operational by the end of 2018. And then recently, just last week, the governor signed a bill which is expected to be amended in early 2018 to create a statewide energy storage target. And the expectations are that the bill will be amended, so it will potentially be a voluntary goal instead of an actual mandate. The law calls on the PSC to investigate and set a target for 2030, and currently NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, has been working on a storage roadmap, and that will serve as the analytical basis for the target that the state is developing. And then California's PUC has the most, well, California, the state of California has the most well-known energy storage target. So a target of 1.325 gigawatt, which the investor-owned utilities in the state have to actually meet by 2024. And then this past year, the PUC also came out with an additional target that IOUs must propose investments for up to 500 megawatts of distributed energy storage as well. And then within the past year alone, too, we are seeing Massachusetts and Oregon also setting energy storage procurement targets. So another area that we tracked in our recent energy storage report is state financial incentives. So Maryland is the first state to create a tax credit for energy storage in the country. And the tax credit is a 30% tax credit for customer-sited energy storage systems. So it's up to $75,000 for corporations and $5,000 for individuals. And this credit will be made available starting in January 2018 and is expected to last until December 2022. And the total amount of credit awarded to all taxpayers cannot exceed $750,000. So it's still a fairly small overall tax credit. Then New York, as part of their reforming the Energy Vision initiative, adopted a value stack pricing system to more accurately compensate energy storage and other distributed energy resources. Then another area of activity that we're seeing among the states is just more educational efforts as well as R&D. So Minnesota came out with last fall their 2025 Energy Action Plan, which looks into how storage can participate in wholesale markets and how partnerships and grants can fund R&D efforts for storage. And then Illinois, as part of their Next Grid initiative and Ohio's Power Forward initiatives, are also working on educating stakeholders about the benefits of energy storage. And New York recently announced $15.5 million in funding for energy storage demonstrations in the state. So these are just a few highlights. You can take a look at our report, Powering Forward, for more state examples out there. And now I'm going to kick everything over to Angie Dykema from Nevada Governor's Office of Energy to provide an overview of Nevada's recent state effort.
All right. Well, thank you, Jessica. So I'm just going to start with a summary of the recent energy storage related legislation we passed our last legislative session, which took place this past winter, spring. And then I'll cover what prompted the passage of this legislation and recommendations for other states seeking to implement similar measures. We passed almost a dozen energy bills in our 2017 legislative session, but I'll focus on three in particular related specifically to storage procurement targets, financial incentives, and resource planning efforts. So the first slide, or next slide, I guess. So the first and arguably most significant we passed was Senate Bill 204, which establishes storage procurement targets. The legislative findings and declarations in this piece of legislation are important to point out because they really set the stage for the other bills that I'm going to cover by highlighting the value of storage to ratepayers and the importance of removing existing barriers to the utilization of energy storage. The legislation describes how energy storage on the electric grid can increase grid efficiency, integrate renewable energy, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, offset the need for costly grid investments, improve grid resiliency, and increase energy security and independence. It also goes on to note that opportunities to deploy storage in the current market can be enhanced by a collaborative approach to resource planning, and that our Public Utilities Commission must determine whether it's in the public interest to establish procurement targets. So how the Commission makes this determination is laid out in the bill with a timeline and a list of considerations that must be used. Next slide, please. So the PUC has until October 1st of next year to make its determination on whether or not to establish a target in its regulations. And during the investigation, the Commission is required to consider how storage will achieve things like integration of renewables, grid reliability, reduction in need for additional generation, avoidance of costs in new transmission system upgrades, ancillary services traditionally provided by fossil fuels or other baseload sources, and the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. These factors are required to be evaluated at each point on the electric grid, so at the transmission and distribution level, as well as customer-sited or behind the meter. In weighing the costs and benefits, the PUC is directed to consider all known and measurable costs and benefits, including those I just mentioned, along with reduction in line losses, voltage support, benefits to having a diverse energy portfolio, administrative costs incurred by the utility, and the actual cost of the storage systems themselves. One of the most unique parts of the bill is the provision allowing the utility to obtain a waiver on the procurement targets if it's unable to identify storage systems that provide benefits to customers which outweigh the costs. If, however, the Commission determines that it is cost-effective to establish the procurement targets, then they will adopt regulations to require the utility to file annual or biennial plans to meet the biennial targets. And then they have to evaluate the targets thereafter every 3 years. This was a bipartisan bill with very little opposition. I think it passed the Senate unanimously and was nearly unanimous in our assembly. I will note that it initially started out with the term storage procurement requirements, but through an amendment, this term was replaced with targets. So it's less of a mandate, which always helps utilities be more comfortable with setting new policy goals. As far as implementation, our Public Utilities Commission opened the investigatory docket earlier this year and has already held one workshop, and the participants are currently holding informal discussions on developing a scope of work for a storage study to be completed by a third-party consultant to help the Commission determine the costs and benefits, and also look at things like economic analysis of different applications of storage and how much could be cost-effectively deployed on our utility system over the next few years. And that's been one of the biggest discussion points so far in the docket, is whether or not a market study similar to what Vermont's going to be talking about and other states like Massachusetts has done, whether or not that would be necessary for implementing this legislation to help determine whether or not it's cost effective on our system. So far, the parties have agreed that such a study would be useful, so we're currently working on a scope of work for that. And next slide. So the next bill I'll highlight is Senate Bill 145, which establishes financial incentives for storage systems. This legislation basically reallocates funding for an existing rebate program called Renewable Generations that was established by our legislature over a decade ago, and it updates it by adding in incentives for storage and electric vehicles. The Renewable Generations program was already created by the legislature to provide incentives to offset installation costs for solar, wind, and hydro systems. And the original target in the program was to incentivize connection of these distributed generation systems with a budget of $295 million and a goal of 250 megawatts. The funding for the program is derived from a volumetric charge on all of our utility ratepayers. And so while there's no current pool of money sitting around, but the renewable generations funding is already being collected through a charge on customers' bills. And so this legislation did not create any kind of additive charge or increase rates in any way. It just changes the program to account for storage systems. At the time of passage of SB 145, the projection showed a surplus of $38 million in the Renewable Generations program, which could be reprogrammed after the 250 megawatt goal was met. And so SB 145 did just that. It combined and reprogrammed the remaining funds. The legislation instructs the Commission to adopt regulations to establish a program to pay incentives for the installation of storage systems by customers of the utility, and goes on to define the minimum benefits or system requirements that must be met for a system to qualify for an incentive. And that's just That's basically reducing peak demand, avoiding grid upgrades, or improving grid reliability. It actually calls for two separate incentive programs for storage. One where regulations must allocate incentives to be paid to customers of the utility within the categories of residential and small commercial or new construction, public entities, and any other category determined by the Commission, with a total budget not to exceed $5 million. And then another incentive program where regulations must establish a collaborative process for the utility to select participants who own a solar system along with a storage system with a nameplate capacity between 100 kilowatts and 1,000 kilowatts, and again, a budget not to exceed $5 million. So it's kind of for the smaller residential systems as well as the larger, more commercial systems. SB 145 also requires the utility to identify locations on its system at which energy storage systems that would qualify for an incentive pursuant to the program have the potential to be installed, and to identify customers who have the potential to satisfy the requirements for an incentive through a collaborative process. So as far as implementation of this one, our Commission opened the investigation and rulemaking docket to implement SB 145 earlier this year as well, and has also already held one workshop. The participants will be filing comments with proposed regulations, and the utility will be filing its annual plan, including the storage incentive, by February 1st of next year. Next slide, please. So SB 146 is the third piece of storage-related legislation we passed this year, which requires storage to be considered in resource planning. In Nevada, we have the traditional integrated resource planning process, which required a plan to be submitted by the utility every 3 years. And under this process, the utility was not required to get advanced approval from the Commission for investments it makes to the distribution system, like line upgrades, transformers, et cetera. Instead, the utility would make investments at its own discretion and then seek recovery of costs after the fact through a general rate case before the Public Utilities Commission. So SB 146 requires the utility to evaluate where distributed energy resources like rooftop solar, electric vehicles, and storage might fit within the distribution system, and then to develop a plan for maximizing their deployment that would be included as part of the integrated resource plan presented to the PUC. So the legislation sets forth requirements for the plan, all listed here, such as evaluating the locational benefits and costs, like I just mentioned. The evaluation must be based on reductions or increases in local generation capacity needs, avoided or increased investments in distribution infrastructure, and safety and reliability benefits, as well as a number of other requirements. As far as implementation of this one, the timeline of the bill requires the first distributed resource plan to be filed by April 1st of 2019, and then a combined IRP, DRP by June 1st of 2021. Next slide. So now we'll move on to what prompted all of this recent action around storage here in Nevada. All of these bills actually stemmed as a result of recommendations from a task force set up by our governor through an executive order last year. Our Nevada statutes governing the Office of Energy include a statutory body called the New Energy Industry Task Force, and it lays out the membership and statute. And basically, when our Legislative Commission's Sunset Subcommittee included this task force as an item on one of their meeting agendas to consider whether or not it should be continued or terminated, our governor and I thought this would be a good opportunity to recommend that instead of the task force being terminated, it be reconvened to address some of the current controversial energy policy issues we were dealing with at the time, like rooftop solar, net metering, and the Clean Power Plan. So the governor issued an executive order instructing me as the director of his Office of Energy to appoint members to the task force to address policies which encourage the development of clean energy sources and integrate renewable energy technologies into our energy sector, create a modern, resilient, and cost-effective energy grid, and support distributed generation and storage, with the goal of providing findings and recommendations in a report to the governor and legislature leading up to our next legislative session. Shortly after the task force was convened, the CPP was put on hold, but we were still left with developing recommendations on how to deal with the solar issue and how best to incorporate these new emerging technologies into our existing business models and electric grid, and evaluating how to ensure that we're embracing the evolving energy future in a way that will position Nevada to lead and not be left behind. So next slide. The task force ultimately produced a report with about 27 different policy recommendations, some of which required statutory changes and some of which did not. So on these next couple of slides, I just included some of the original recommendations, which the legislature ultimately picked up and transformed into the 3 storage bills that I just described. The first recommendation to include a definition of storage was incorporated into all 3 of those storage bills and ultimately became SB 146, with the requirement for consideration in utilities planning processes. And the second recommendation for cost-effective procurement targets ultimately became SB 204. The task force meetings leading up to the adoption of these policy recommendations included all kinds of presentations on the benefits of storage to the electric grid, and also the significant barriers to deploying energy storage, which were identified as legacy grid procedures and tariffs that don't really contemplate the use of storage on the grid. And the discussion centered around how utility planning, valuation, operations, procurement, interconnection, and rate design were not systematically incorporating energy storage. So the task force felt that by demonstrating a commitment to utilize storage procurement targets would shape grid processes that fully incorporate storage and allow the state to uncover opportunities where storage is a more cost-effective investment than traditional grid infrastructure. Originally, this recommendation required that a small amount of storage procurement would occur by 2019, a larger amount by 2021, and a substantial amount by 2023. No numbers actually assigned, but clearly a steady increase. And the task force didn't think that mandated storage targets were appropriate unless our PUC could study and show the cost effectiveness of interconnecting these technologies. And so the task force agreed that the recommendation should be for the Public Utilities Commission to study and implement procurement targets only where appropriate and cost effective, and that there should not be a deadline or a predefined target. So this is one recommendation I would make for any other states considering similar legislation. We made sure the bill was crafted carefully so it would lay a clear path for adoption of storage technology consistent with our state goals without necessarily jumping into a predefined target that may or may not get us to where we'd like to be. So no predefined number that could potentially affect project prices and rates, but a requirement for a utility to seriously look into its utilization and seize the opportunity for deployment when cost effective. Next slide. The last couple of recommendations had to do with authorizing the use of the uncommitted renewable generations program funding to promote new technologies like electric vehicles and storage, and incentives for storage demonstration projects. We did not ultimately end up with a funding bill for a pilot or demonstration project, but we did end up with SB 145, which created the financial incentives. And the Governor's Office of Energy is actually looking into utilization of our DOE State Energy Program formula grant funding as a mechanism to supplement these storage policy efforts and possibly do a demonstration project of some sort. So we're still looking into utilizing that recommendation as part of our storage efforts. So Jessica also asked me to cover any recommendations or best practices for other states, and I apologize in advance if anyone else on the call had to listen to me present at the Energy Innovation Summit earlier this fall, because I'm going to be a little repetitive here, but Governor Sandoval, as chair of the NGA, has selected Innovation in Energy and Transportation, or the Ahead of the Curve Innovation Governors Initiative, as we call it. And so part of staying ahead of the curve on innovation and technological advancements, how we see it, at least in the energy sector, requires a clear understanding of your goals and where you want to be, along with identifying the challenges and opportunities for growth, and then taking action through smart policy and legislation to make things happen. So the next slide. One of the actions that we did take, which has kind of guided us to take these recent steps on storage policy, was an effort that the executive branch undertook to create a strategic planning framework for our state. We worked on this before the last legislative session earlier this year, and it actually took place during the task force meetings as well. The governor and my fellow cabinet members went through a strategic planning exercise and identified a number of goals applicable to our areas of expertise and objectives on how to reach those goals. So I just highlighted our main energy goal is to become the nation's leading producer and consumer of clean and renewable energy, which of course becomes much more feasible with technologies like storage when your majority of your state portfolio is comprised of solar. And this was a guiding document, I guess, for the task force as they were coming up with their policy recommendations. And so slide 10. Another activity in which we've participated over the past few years that has helped to define and formalize our state goals is our membership on the Governor's Accord for a New Energy Future. And that is a bipartisan state-led initiative which includes 17 governors across the nation who all signed on to work together to identify common priorities and address clean energy opportunities and challenges. So the goals listed in the Accord are very broad, but it, again, kind of served as a guiding document for the task force and our legislature as we look to identify what sort of infrastructure is necessary to manage increases in distributed generation in a cost-effective and efficient way, and to ensure that we remain on a path toward energy innovation generally. So I think that's actually my last slide. So I'll just end by saying, in addition to establishing clear goals, I would say that it's all about striking a balance. Our legislature was careful not to let the size of these targets or incentives get so big as to have a negative effect on ratepayers, but at the same time to allow distributed energy resources like storage the ability to grow so that we can deploy and learn from them and stay ahead of the curve. So that's why I pointed out the cost effectiveness provision included in our storage procurement target legislation. We wanted to be on top of storage and make sure to pave a path forward for its advancement, but not at an unreasonable expense. So we've set the stage to examine the issue thoroughly before establishing any mandatory procurement targets. And the same goes for any kind of financial incentives as well. You know, it's enough to raise awareness of these technologies and allow for their deployment, but not enough to be a negative impact to ratepayers. So it's all about striking a balance. And that is it for me.
Thanks, Angie. And now we'll hand things over to Anne from the state of Vermont.
Thanks, Angie. Thanks, Jessica. Probably what you'll hear in a contrast to my presentation with Angie's is just, you know, for every state there's a different flavor of how you might want to look at energy storage, and you know, it's very dependent on the context of what's going on in your particular state. So I'm going to run through what's going on here in Vermont with energy storage. I will cover some of the projects that are here in these pretty pictures on my cover slide, and I will talk about a legislative report that we've recently completed that was requested of us this last session. Next, please. So just a quick note on who we are. We're the Department of Public Service, which is the consumer advocate for the state in utility matters. before the Public Utility Commission. We also house the State Energy Office, as well as energy and telecommunications planning functions. And we're responsible as part of that for creating the statewide electrical energy and comprehensive energy plans every 6 years. The current statewide comprehensive energy plan, which was issued in early 2016, calls for a target of 90% renewables across all sectors, energy sectors, by 2050. That plan includes a discussion of energy storage within the larger chapter on managing demand. And we were already thinking about storage in the context of that comprehensive energy plan, as well as in discussions with utilities about what they were looking to do. And we had issued a small grant which leveraged some Department of Energy funding several years ago, which resulted in a utility scale storage project, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Next, please. So we had already been thinking about energy storage, and about a year ago, the state of Massachusetts, our neighbor to the south, had been undertaking their own very comprehensive energy storage study, and they had recently released their state of charge report, running up to our last legislative session. If you haven't seen that, you definitely want to take a look. It's a very comprehensive look at energy storage in Massachusetts, including a pretty detailed analysis of costs and benefits for their state. So our legislature was very interested in understanding energy storage in the context of Massachusetts' very, aggressive actions in energy storage. I say that in a good way. Massachusetts had also been thinking about setting a target for their achievement of storage, and that hadn't been set at that time. It has since then. But our legislature wanted to know sort of what does storage look like here? What does it look like in the context of another state in the region pursuing energy storage? So this is a summary of what they asked us to do, which we did, and we also had a stakeholder consultation process as part of that. Our stakeholders submitted some really on-point and helpful comments, and I suggest if you're going to look at our report, which is at this link, you also take a look at some of those comments that were submitted. Next, please. In conducting our what's called the Act 53 storage study, we actually ended up feeling somewhat constrained by the singular focus on energy storage. The conversations we were having at the time and that we had since with stakeholders were really largely about the challenges and the growing pains that we're facing in the state as we go through grid transformation and we try to integrate high penetrations of distributed energy resources, as well as some of the cost pressures that are coming from the regional level. Ideally, I think we would have conducted a study that looked at these issues and least cost solutions to them, one of which might have been storage. Some states are having that kind of broader grid transformation conversation. We're kind of having it here and there in a piecemeal fashion. And we only had about 5 months to do this study, and we were doing it in-house, so we sort of had limited time and means to conduct it, and that would have been a much bigger apple than we could have taken a bite out of. So we realized we were looking through the storage lens, and at the same time we felt it imperative to keep the sort of broader perspective in mind and storage's place within it. And really, sort of, if you sum up our study, you could arrive at the conclusion that our philosophy around energy storage is that it's a means to an end rather than an end in and of itself. Next, please. I mentioned some of the challenges we're facing with high penetrations of distributed generation. We have a solar penetration of about 200 megawatts in the context of a peak load of about 1,000 megawatts. Year over year, solar is reducing the daily load that's visible to grid operators, and in essence pushing the daily peaks out to after dark, where incremental solar will not have as great of a benefit. On some days, sunny days in the spring, for instance, on a shoulder season, the net load at 3 p.m. is actually lower than the net load that the grid operators see at 3 a.m. Next, please. So grid operators now have to contend with a shifting load shape, and that load shape is also highly weather dependent. At the regional level, the independent system operator of New England, they're keenly aware of the rapid growth of distributed energy resources, and they're actually investing in weather and load forecasting tools to help them understand better and in a more granular and flexible way what each day's load is going to look like. On a cold, clear morning in winter, solar has the potential to reduce peaks just like it does in summer, but that benefit sort of bottoms out around 2 in the afternoon and then creates a need for additional ramping to meet the evening peak. According to the independent system operator, that's a manageable situation now, but it could become sort of a problematic at higher penetrations of solar, and they're trying to get a handle on that with a PV forecast they do every year. When panels are snow covered, they're not helping to reduce peaks, and the worst case scenario for them is a snowstorm followed by extremely cold weather, which for us in the New England region would be potential constraint to our pipelines for our gas plants, and also would reduce solar availability for a few days. So, in talking to the region, they'll say, grid scale storage can help even out intra-hourly solar variability, and it can help time shift solar from hours of peak generation to hours of peak load. But really what they're looking toward is multi-day or even seasonal storage. Next, please. So at the local level here in Vermont, this is sort of a solar penetration map or a solar availability map. You could look at it either way. That Green Mountain Power, our largest utility and our only investor-owned utility, has. This is a screenshot of their map. It changes. So the red shows areas of the distribution grid that are experiencing limits to how much additional generation can be accommodated without, potentially expensive studies and grid upgrades. The yellow areas are sort of getting close to becoming red. And green, there's no problems at this point. So this is an indicator for developers, and it's an indicator also where storage likely has a role to play, although there may be sort of other solutions to addressing those red areas. And there's if you want to have sort of unlimited access to more and more solar development, even on rooftops, we're starting to get to the question of who's going to pay for the grid upgrades required to accommodate that generation. We don't have load growth in Vermont, but we have a great deal of generation growth, so it kind of flips the cost causation question on its head, and that's one of the things we're struggling with, as you'll see in the study. In terms of sort of local distribution grid power quality issues caused by existing high penetrations of solar, that's a little bit of a different question, and that's one our utilities are already actively exploring with storage. Next, please. And just sort of on a more meta scale, we are facing an area in northern Vermont that's actually subject to export constraints, where there's at times much more generation, particularly from 2 large wind facilities, than there is load. Sort of a weak area of the transmission grid, and it's curtailed to maintain system stability and reliability by the independent system operator. So that's an area where storage might have a role to play as well. Next, please. So those are some of the growing pains that we're facing in Vermont. Storage, we feel, can help address those, but it might not always be the most cost-effective solution, or it might not yet be. Our state energy policy emphasizes finding least cost solutions, and we feel there could be other non-wire solutions that could be more cost effective than storage, potentially including load management and demand response. And we feel that sending the right technology neutral pricing signals, particularly signals that align the region to the utility to the customer, will be really key in producing those solutions. Next, please. In looking at solutions, though, we acknowledge that storage has this Swiss Army knife-like quality where it can address high penetrations of distributed generation. It can also help lower costs associated with peak. This chart shows the regional system in red and the Vermont system in blue with the demand by hour across the course of a year. Really, if you draw a horizontal line across the top of those peaks, there's sort of a lot of wasted capacity in the system, which is built to accommodate those peaks. Storage can charge off peak, discharge on peak, and lower utility costs associated with peaks, so capacity and transmission costs. And that's really where the monetizable benefits of storage are for our utilities right now, and that's why they are pursuing storage at this point. But we are paying attention to matters like diminishing returns with higher penetration of storage in the region and the state, as well as potential kind of cost shifting to other utilities. Next, please. And obviously, storage also has the ability to provide grid resiliency in the event of outages. The big system-wide outage in 2003 in the background picture, ice storms. There's a tropical storm Irene on the lower left. We've had regular occurrences of multi-day outages due to weather. We just had one in early November from a large wind event that really created outages across the state that was difficult for utilities and customers. Next, please. So this is our Venn diagram we like to trot out whenever we can, which shows, at the nexus of all of those circles, the ideal storage project will be cost-effective for ratepayers by maximizing, the peak management and other wholesale market opportunities. But it will also achieve some of the benefits of integrating renewables and grid resiliency. We recognize there are trade-offs when you try to achieve all three, and we're just starting to see projects that pencil out for ratepayers. Those could be anywhere in a utility's territory, and we're urging utilities and developers to look for sites that can achieve those other benefits. But what's driving siting decisions for storage at this point is really land availability or site availability and sort of lack of interconnection issues. Next, please. You've probably all seen some representation of this value stack for storage. Our Venn diagram is one other way of looking at that. This value stack doesn't include the resiliency benefits. We also don't have the distribution investment deferral because we don't have load growth, but really we just want to see the benefit stack be higher than the cost stack, and as the costs of storage go down, we expect sort of that delta will get larger, and there will be greater benefits for ratepayers. But we are also cautious that utilities and developers are not overscheduling or double counting benefits that may not be simultaneously achievable. Next, please. So before I just run through our recommendations from our report, I want to give folks a snapshot of the storage ecosystem in Vermont right now. These are some of our utility-led storage activities. Some of the most projects at this point are being done by Green Mountain Power, which is our investor-owned utility and our largest owned utility. On the upper left is the project that we were able to leverage our little $50,000 grant with some DOE funding and then a bunch more utility funding to create what's called the Stafford Hill microgrid project, which is on a capped landfill in Rutland, and it's a 3.4 megawatt hour storage and 2 megawatt solar project, which is also able to island the distribution circuit that has the local high school, which is also an emergency shelter on it. And that's been up and running for a couple of years now. Green Mountain Power also has, sort of in the middle of the bottom there, what's called their Tesla Powerwall pilot program. They are enabling their customers to lease Powerwall units for $15 a month with shared access by the utility. So the customer is able to use those during an outage, depending on the plug loads. That could be, up to 24 hours. And then the utility can access and aggregate all of those units for peak shaving and other wholesale market values. Other utilities are exploring projects. There's a few installations here. Burlington Electric Department has a battery installation on the lower right. They're looking at a airport microgrid project. Greenmount Power has 2 utility scale batteries before the Public Utility Commission. And then Velco, I mentioned that sort of export constrained area of the state. Our statewide transmission utility, Velco, is looking at storage to potentially alleviate some of that constraint. Next, please. And then there we have a whole bunch of non-utility actors also working in the storage arena. We have solar developers who have been for a long time working with customers on grid-tied and off-grid storage backup systems for customers. And then we have a few sort of controls manufacturers and integrators. Dynapower's on the upper left. You'll see their test pad where they can test vendors' different battery projects, battery technologies with their wind turbine and their solar, so they can sort of provide a testing venue. And they're also creating their own products. On the left, they have their DC to DC converter and a dynamic transfer switch for switching to backup power without interruption in an outage situation. But we have developers that are working with some of our utilities to do a shared benefit, shared value type of instrument. And then we also, on a residential scale, Greenmount Power is developing a bring your own device program where a customer or a vendor could, or a third party could come in and use a non-Tesla product and sort of plug into the system and have shared benefits and values. Next, please. So our report really, follows the model of NGA's 2016 report, which was very helpful. We don't recommend really anything radical here. We have a pretty robust storage ecosystem, as I mentioned, here in the state. All of our utilities at this point are exploring storage projects and are looking to move ahead when they prove cost-effective for customers. Our current utility integrated resource planning guidance discusses storage, and when we issue new guidance, we'll include some more methodology for conducting cost-effectiveness studies. Rate design, I think I mentioned, dynamic pricing is somewhere where we're really taking a look and that will have some benefits for storage. We just went through a big net metering redesign, so we're not looking to kind of open that up again at this point, but when we do look at net metering next time, we'll look at the goals of aligning load and generation and sort of time of production type of pricing. Our Vermont Emergency Management Agency, as well as we, are working in our emergency management and energy assurance capabilities to make sure storage is considered every time sort of grid failure is discussed and examined. And then in regulatory review process and criteria, this is sort of the one sort of tangible recommendation we're really making, is to ensure, just like any generation or transmission investment or project, that our Public Utility Commission would also have the opportunity to review storage projects, whether they're grid scale or residential scale. Our interconnection standards, we have a pending new interconnection rule that explicitly addresses storage. We don't see a need for change there. For existing programs or new programs, we have another $50,000 that we're going to allocate and hopefully leverage in FY18 for storage. We're not quite sure how. We have a standard offer program, which is like a feed-in tariff. We don't think that's the best place to put storage, and we think it needs to be looked at more holistically, so we're not recommending changes to that. I talked about net metering already. And our renewable energy standard includes storage in Tier 3, which is an energy transformation tier. But the goal there is to achieve fossil fuel reductions, so storage has not been the low-hanging fruit there. And in terms of procurement targets, again, given the activity that our utilities and our third parties are doing, we don't think procurement targets are necessary. And we also think, in terms of spurring utilities to action, and we think that, setting a target could lead to, an assumption that storage is the correct or the least cost solution to a particular need. So I think we feel that at this point, we'd like to see what happens in the next year. We think a lot's going to happen with storage in Vermont, and then at that point sort of reevaluate whether any kind of target is necessary. But at this point, we think if there is a target, it should allow for a lot of flexibility in implementation, and also, of course, be predicated on cost effectiveness, as Angie discussed. So at that point, next slide is just the link to the study again and my contact information. Thanks.
Thank you, Anne. And just as a quick reminder, if you have any, we have about 5 minutes remaining for questions. If you have any questions, you can type them in to me in the questions pane at the bottom of your GoToWebinar toolbar. And I know we had at least 1 or 2 questions come in. Let me look. It looks like the first one is for Anne. So Anne, the first question for you is, what are some examples of double counting storage benefits that you talked about?
Yep. So when we are looking, we're a party to the Public Utility Commission process, the Section 248 process, where we are actually looking at the project proposals that utilities or a merchant would request. And so as part of that, we're kind of digging into the financial modeling of the project. And in that work, generally what the project is trying to do is achieve wholesale power benefits. And so that would be primarily hitting peaks, so hitting the monthly and the annual peaks. But that project is also going to be trying to reap some compensation from the frequency regulation market. And the project may be also trying to perform energy arbitrage, and it may be also trying to meet some of the limits in terms of if it's paired with solar and wants to get the investment tax credit. It may also be trying to charge and discharge from solar, and discharge during times of non-solar production. So we are looking sort of on an hour-by-hour basis at the financial modeling of the project to make sure that that resource is not being double committed for those different functions when one of those functions would discount it from being able to perform one of the other functions. If that makes sense.
Thanks, Anne. And Angie, just one question for you. You talked about the Solar Energy Systems Incentive Program and the 2 separate pots of money under that, so the $5 million to residential, small commercial, new construction, public entities. For that first pot of $5 million, who is in charge of implementing, again, or kind of doling out those funds? Is that just the state energy office?
Yeah, so the utility is in charge of administering the program, but the PUC has to establish the regulations around it. So that's what the investigation and rulemaking docket is all about right now at our Public Utilities Commission. Regulations have been proposed by some of the parties, including the utility, and the Public Utilities Commission will approve those regulations, and then the utility will be administering the program. They're going to propose to use a third-party design contractor and dole it out similar to how they've been doing their existing solar, wind, and hydro rebate incentives program.
And you mentioned, too, that the utility proposals are due February 2018. Is that correct? And then the program will roll out later in 2018?
Yeah, so it's kind of, the proposals have been submitted as comments as part of the investigatory docket, but the first annual plan will be submitted to the Public Utilities Commission by the utility on February 1st, and then the PUC will have to approve the plan, and then the funds will become available June, July next year.
Thank you. And just to wrap up, one quick wrap-up question for you both. So what kind of new energy storage policy trends do you think we'll be talking about in the next year or two? Do you think it will still be, mainly states focused on procurement targets, or, including storage and their resource planning processes, or do you think it might be something else in the next couple of years, policy-wise?
Well, this is Angie from Nevada. I'll take a stab at that one.
Okay.
I think probably we'll see around the country a lot more states at least considering procurement targets. If not, probably more pilot programs and demonstration projects. And really, one of the things that we're kind of looking at too are more looking at demand charges and the applicability to like smaller on the building, like individual building level, and how we can deal with energy efficiency and peak shaving on that level as well. I don't know, Anne, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, for us, I think we hope that there will be focus on sort of the dynamic pricing and alignment from the regional down to the state to the customer level, and the information technology and communications technology to kind of enable that to happen. That may be more than a year out, but it's, we often kind of look out at what's going on in Hawaii to say, what are we going to be facing here? What are other high penetration solar states going to be facing? And the trend toward policies that encourage maximizing self-consumption or exporting power when it's beneficial to the grid or to ratepayers, or at least not problematic, seems like it's sort of on the horizon for a number of states, and possibly including us.
Cool. Thank you, Anne and Angie. I know we're a little bit over the hour, so I just want to wrap things up. Thank you both for speaking about regarding what your states have recently done to advance storage. And for those that haven't already seen it, NGA has a couple of papers on energy storage. Our most recent one is called Powering Up: State Trends for Advancing the Use of Energy Storage, and it's available on our website. And then we also have a paper available on energy storage and recent state policy activity from October 2016. And with that, I will close out the webinar. Thank you, everyone, for joining in.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jessica.
Bye.